Hello everyone, today we do something a little experimental such as video commenting, and I want to particularly address a video section of the recent last week's interview by Piers Morgan of Jordan Peterson regarding specifically the Putin-Ukraine bit. Right. So first of all, this is not a video about the war in Ukraine per se. It's not even a video about Putin. So it's a completely different thing. In many ways, I have been talking about, say, Ukraine in general. You know what side I am, and I have been pretty consistent with it also since I followed the entire thing from many years. Back in the day, I wanted to go Ukraine. I remember that I even talked to a contractor in my country to see how it was. You know, my family would have prevented me from going there, would have killed me before I could have get myself killed as well. But let's say today I think let's say the same, but in different terms, and I hope to be more useful in a different way. Naturally, I have a small channel, so I don't pretend this video to have who knows which reach. I care, though, and this is the most important thing, about my followers to be selected enough, right? I have seen just the other day's video in which I was equating how I completely and fully coherently in my background identify as a ultra-conservative right-winger myself, the alt-right as the left, and that this brings to an epuration in the channel, because there is an overwhelming support to the idea, also because it's that simple, right? If you know any of military religious universal tradition, which is a much more viciously brutal thing that you can imagine compared to any of the, in fact, weakening that National Socialism fundamentally represents, just as a degeneration of humanity as a concept that is both left and right, and that the average person, again, the fourth estate, identifies as the only level, the horizontal one, the one of the maggots, of the insects, of the chthonic world, and completely ignoring the vertical, heavenly, divine one. Well, you cannot quite go anywhere in life, right? It's an extremely simple concept. If it weren't for the fact that if you can see it, it makes the entire problem in your life at every level. And the world degenerates. It's meant to, in this sense, for humanity to lose humanity and to grow incredibly weaker. But this is exactly what we're witnessing in a moment of crisis, in an advanced stage. Of course, we're talking about a millenary perspective here, to highlight certain points that regard essentially the manipulation, the misinterpretation of certain specific content in of course, for a purpose that I think is really understood rationally by those who finance this, right? And everybody does that. There is not a conspiracy theory. It's simply exploiting the dumb people, and there is actually nothing wrong with exploiting people, because everybody's fully and exclusively and totally responsible for their own choices. The problem is, you know, what is your choice as well there to exploit them in which sense, right? Civilization exploits people in a positive sense for mutual benefit. Subculture does exploit for an immediate irrelevant gain in the broader picture, but the erosion of the entire system. Already this concept is completely alien to, let's say, the average political thinking, right? From one side you have essentially the paranoid who believe that, so this is mostly the fourth estate, that fundamentally believes there is some sort of tyranny in the world that is capable of controlling everything, and you're just a sort of victim slash hero slash scapegoat to evil. And then there are the, you know, better people that still on average, live without posing themselves too many questions after all, and so they also tend to gradually slide towards the bottom of the lesser ones. And this is the problem with all, right? The universal tradition tells you that you should heroically speed to the top, both in an imperial sense, in a cultural sense, in a personal sense, and lord over the world, right? And you should, in order to do that, you should do it by actually lording over the world and having that degree of power, right? You could even do that if everyone were so weak to give you their power, because human potential is given there, right? That this is what happens in totalitarianism, in any kind of, more, authoritarian direction. And the point of a civilization is to confer everyone much greater power to confer, right? In other words, to make people ever more individually responsible and powerful, to let an establishment rule, and in this mechanism, being all individually part of it, the more individually powerful you are, in order to be overall a greater power and a truly universal one, right? The delusion, of course, of the fourth estate is that this can be achieved without requiring any form of sacrifice from the individual. The entire universal tradition is founded on the concept of self-sacrifice, and as a matter of fact, the absolute one is also the one that brings to the ultimate goal and the ultimate achievement. I made a specific video that addressed part of it. Was in that case Peterson's interview to some, I think it was the Weinstein couple. It was mostly a scientifically themed video because it talked about academies, scientific culture, and so on. And already in that video, I was criticizing essentially the lack, even from the top, let's say, so-called conservative figures, right, prominently in a popular cultural sense. Peterson could be the lack of that. First of all, the realization of that broader ecumenic and truly sacrificial dimension, right? Why do I say this specifically? Because Peterson acknowledges that, right? He acknowledges, even in religion, even within Christianity, the meaning of sacrifice, the meaning of salvation in a broader sense, but he objectively, just as a clinical psychologist, and quoting mostly, fundamentally, works of his discipline and some religious reference, skips just by background, because he's not specialized in that, any political, also military concern. As you know, Schwerpunkt is mostly a military and religious themed channel, and most of the things I do are not even concretely connected with this broader view, meaning that I sometimes just fill the channel with more narrowly spaced and timed videos. But whenever I get on these topics, I get, surprisingly enough, a lot of support, a lot of consensus, right? There is a minimal fraction that just hates me, and this mostly comes from, in fact, the aforementioned alt-righters and leftists, and there is a specific reason for that, because they represent that extreme of the fourth estate that cannot tolerate the idea that the individual must have an objective power, right? They have their own version of it, that is to say, just whining, because they don't have any of that, and so betraying the very meaning of the entire universal tradition. It is to say, if you have actually any value, you have power. It's automatic. It's not even to be asked or for, because that just means that you don't, right? And this, in part, of course, I could make entire videos, and I probably will, right, on these topics, on how and why the world came to this. This is not as very often the self-sabotaging alt-righters and leftists do, like saying, this is a Western problem. It's no coincidence that alt-righters and leftists self-sabotage their own country. And which country? Because there are countries, and they make much relativism on that as well. And they essentially they do both believe in critical race theory, right? They're essentially racial supremacists of any sort. That's what it gets down to, because they don't have anything outside of what they look in any cultural form, right? So that's what they cannot stand, and that's why they get loose and aggressive. The only problem being, for them at least, unfortunately for the rest, is that the world does have enough power to essentially keeping them at the bottom, meaning that the major feature of this state of fourth age, and also consequently fourth estate, the generation, is the weakness of people, right? If just looking comparison historically over the generations, what were extremists capable of doing and what they're fundamentally not capable of doing today. This is very important for political discourse, because you can never the ultimate end of humanity is not some sort of say distraction operated by the fourth estate in the sense of let's say getting aggressive and killing each other. It's just about giving up. It's about letting themselves die, right? Not having enough power fundamentally to any force. Civilization is force, and that's why they want to tear it down. How to do it? Using force? No, by subtracting it. And that's why they need to tell you there are the strong powers that are imposing who knows what on the people, because what they're actually doing is just, as people, giving up any power and just reducing everything to just to disgregate everything without acting, inaction. The entire universal tradition is founded in action based on knowledge at the same time, because the more you know, the more you act, the more powerful you are. The main feature of today's extremism, as always extremism has been, is the lack of such knowledge. It's shipwrecking realities, such as during revolutions, whatever. Not because the people ever obtains any power in the process, but because it loses it. This is historically the entire point of any revolution. Revolutions never brought the people in power. Never. They just brought them actually under a much greater lordship, much more powerful one, that eventually depleted them further of their own as they were responsible for it. Same thing. They didn't want to have any responsibility, so I give power to others, and that's how it happens. Power is not materialistically owned. That's why also any form of kind of socialistically influenced ideology, as again from leftism to neo-Nazism, etc., are based on materialism. In other words, the people want somebody else to give them stuff to ensure them, say, food. You say, but Nazi Germany was ideologically driven. The fact that there is a pinch of national awareness, which is still different from nationalism, and this is present also in any communist regime that always has a nationalistic nature deeply ingrained in it as well, is founded on the concept that, of course, everyone must have something just because they are born, let's say, within a reality that independently from the power and the capacity and therefore the cultural value to achieve that concrete result must be given. It's a parasitic form. That's why National Socialism rose to power when the Germans needed millions of marks to buy bread, right? So that's the most obvious, direct, emergential, populational depletion state, let's say, that brings people to confer power to others that can, in this sense, simply monopolize it without meeting resistance in its employ, right? The same goes for communism, etc. And there is a very interesting cultural, say, geography, I would even say, regarding, where such phenomena spread the most, and it's obviously the most culturally underdeveloped ones, right? If you wonder why communism spread specifically in certain countries, why it was stronger also within certain areas of the West, it's always because of cultural inferiority. It's never because, say, even those who today act as Marxists actually give a shit about that. Those are the richest people sometimes. And yes, there is that too. This is not let's say, a conservativistic conspiracy. This is, as I was saying before, they're clever in doing that, because there are people who let them do that, except that's just a bad choice. That's a bad ground in which to invest, and it will still bring back a lot of problems to the same people who enacted. Instead, there is a better way that is based, again, on individual power, that is not invested in, right? And today's commentary wants to highlight this kind of giving up, right? Rather than seeing, let's say, certain figures as great charismatic leaders that voice your personal frustration that is not, again, justified, right? If you are, this is, at the end of the day, saying Peterson's message. If you don't, say, tidy your room first, you cannot tidy up the world either, right? But to which extent is this pushed? This is the only difference that is made in universal tradition. And if you give up on specific concepts, on specific actions, on specific responsibilities, you are fundamentally not abiding by those principles at all, right? So while it's easy for an intelligent person today, at least for today's standards, to eventually just repeat concepts that were expressed by other figures, right? In this video, I would like to express this fact that I truly think Peterson to be an intelligent person. I also estimate him. I've been learning from him, right? But then you also grow up, in a sense, and you realize, especially in fields that, true fields that Peterson doesn't know, that of course there is not just that dimension. There is another one, and yet another one, which just means to expand the same concept and providing you proportionally with greater power, right? So you can know Jung, Piaget, whatever. You can understand certain religious concept, but let's be honest, the same author here is not particularly competent in history of religions. Have you ever listened to him to discuss, for example, even very simply the same traditional religion as we do it on this channel? He grasps, let's say, a tiny part of that, and then he doesn't go to the extremes, because he has not been learning certain specific aspects, or hasn't pushed his knowledge in that specific field that far, right? He's a clinical psychologist, so he's not a politologist, he's not a strategic analyst, he's not a military historian, he's not even a historian in general, right? I must say, as most conservative political commentators are also followed for a long time, historical competence, awareness, education is extremely poor, extremely low, right? And this is not a good sign at all, right? So, as I was saying before, there is another, say, it's the same way to conservatism. Peterson got it, right? But he's just at a certain step of the road where he doesn't take it too far. And when you don't take it too far, you also fall short of many other things, right? So it's normal to fail, right? And that's the problem that we are, in a sense, discussing today, and that poses an enormous danger because, as I was saying, yes, this is exploited by specific groups by specific people in general to or orientate. People just appreciate, for example, Peterson as a broad figure, this enormous success, not because they have any particular individual quality, capacity, ability, intelligence, responsibility, force. If so, it were, if all the people that we're seeing today affected by these ideas were actually understanding them, we could have, the world would have just decuplicated its GDP. I'm not kidding, right? If that is the extremes you were talking about, you would have, for example, lots of other people just even superseding Peterson and other figures in this kind of knowledge spread. Instead, this does not happen. It's a physical, also kind of an economical principle. You can't think just by saying something that's something, especially the broader, more complex and more qualitative it is, can't be assimilated immediately. That's why we teach people for years certain specific things before them being able to get somewhere where they can handle a specific and mostly still relatively narrow side of the story. We talk about this all the time. In other words, you're not going to be an accomplished human being just because you listen to Peterson's content, and most of Peterson's content is designed exactly to make you a better person. The only difference there is whether you make the work to be a better person, and that's the actually difficult thing. Just to hear something, you have the capacity of fully understanding it, and therefore just to being immediately motivated by that. What I was saying also about universal tradition is that the more you know, the more you act, because yes, there is an illusion that knowledge is simple, and so we always, in a sense, overestimate the let's say the quality of our knowledge, so that we think we're acting actually in a exceptional way. We mostly don't, right? And when you actually see that someone that is supposed also to be competent fundamentally expresses also a simplistic judgment about things that are not even truly discussed or entered into the technicalities, the concreteness of the specific subjects that we study constantly, because of course it's full of experts about that. You can't just resolve, as many people began to, because this section of the video kind of echoed everywhere, was used by lots of other channels, getting millions of views, whatever. It's a 6 minutes video. What is being said, as we'll see now, is practically nothing, right? It's it's a fair take along some patterns. Under others, actually, it's actually very debatable. But it's 6 minutes. It's just an unexplained opinion that just because a figure that is popular expressed is used as a sort of in fact, denial of what this person has been teaching for his entire life, in terms of the enormous effort that you should make, and also the humility that you should own to make any sensible change, and not basically becoming an hysterical fanatic that just because you say, Peterson said it, and so, are you able to explain the broader problem? Do you even try? All this aspect is skipped. Right, and this is what I would like to stress, that I have, specific issues with certain things Peterson said, but in general, yes, it's a good take, right? I'm not, compared to the masses, of course it's a good one, but it doesn't mean it's the one we need, or the one that is going to solve the problem, or the one that is going to make people more intelligent at all, unfortunately. By any sensible degree. I will be commenting later also what is happening at this level with Peterson's work, how this is being handled, and this is being marketed specifically, even by his own channel that he presumably doesn't run, or at least he runs, but evidently subcontracts to somebody else that presents the content in very different terms, very clickbaiting ones, and therefore also kind of creepily distorting ones of the same Peterson's content, and how this fundamentally feeds an enormous damage and kind of self-entitlement exactly by those people who are craving for any form of entitlement just because they never had one in their entire life. With the aforementioned kind of consequences, that he's bailing out from any responsibility, letting the enormous effort that is needed in this very critical moment in history to make, and essentially self-sabotaging the entire humanity in the process. So since I'm also too lazy, as the world is degenerating, and I just am in the wake of that, I haven't uploaded here the audio of the video, also in order actually to avoid copyright issues. I know it would be perfectly fine, because if I am reviewing such a short content, at the end of the day, nothing happens. But you can easily find the content online. Like, it's just I'm using this one. It's titled, it's the official Piers Morgan thing. Jordan Peterson debates the psychology of Vladimir Putin with Piers Morgan. The channel is Piers Morgan Uncensored, and this got more than 1 million views. And it's been, again, the reason why I came across it is that it is incidental. I actually came across another video that is terrifying, and it's exactly the one that I've been fundamentally criticizing with my with this introduction, which is, if you give me a second, I'll tell you. It's just another guy. This is basically an alt-righter who is making a complete eulogium of Putin overtly, so not because I interpret it as such. This is the channel is specifically designed to support Vladimir Putin, to make it appear as a good, competent person who is achieving the great result of destroying an allegedly liberal world, or whatever you want. I repeat it. I'm a right-wing ultra-conservative. I've always been my entire life. So to me, this is very new, right? I could talk again at length, and I probably will, about what's happening specifically in this case in the United States, because that's an American channel. There is a plague, right? We all have some, as wherever we come from. Well, isolationism is a great problem, and it mostly reflects that very easy attitude of kind of, not giving a damn about whatever happens in the world, because in your opinion, not dealing with the complexity of it should be the solution to it, which is the conservative foreign policy version of a leftist safe space, right? That doesn't make you any safer at all, because you cannot ignore reality, and that is also what universal tradition imposes you. The name of the channel is Dr. Steve Turley. I would really like to see what kind of doctor he is, said by someone who is actually a doctor but doesn't say it all the freaking time. In any case, that video had even more views significantly than the actual Morgan's short there, and we're talking about 1.5 million views, right? So this is also very eloquent to make you understand how propagandistic echo chambers inflate and distort and kind of create a devilish surplus out of something that in fact is not really like that. Like, if you listen to Turley's video, you say, oh my god, Peterson has gone insane. Then you actually watch Morgan's interview, and Morgan is not really debating that, right? The reason why the video is so short is that Peterson was a host that was just talking about lots of things at a time, probably in a limited time. I don't know what kind of these interviews are, like half an hour, something like that. And so the cut about Ukraine is just those 6 minutes, but the rest of the video if you want to check, it's surely integral out there, is also available somewhere, maybe on the same Morgan's aforementioned channel. I would also like to spend a word about Morgan. He's a, let's say, he's a person that I don't like, generally speaking. I mean, I think, he's a charming British personality, but at the same time, I don't like his political doings, right? The fact that, first of all, you have come to, I don't know how old he is, but, up to just the last year, you've been essentially a liberal your entire adult life. So not until you were 20 or 30, but let's say way beyond that, you've been essentially always kind of a moral relativist and a hypocrite, just those that rebut to people's assertions by just absolutizing your own moral relativistic side and actually morally shocked about that. It's a bit like how remember when he's the one who made Ben Shapiro famous because of that thing, how they are just standing on those children's grave, that the candle line, and that's how hypocritical the whole thing was. I followed for a long time, still do occasionally, the Daily Wire, right, and I have a general sympathy towards not just that side of American conservatism, but specifically towards Shapiro, except also the Daily Wire seems to have gone, at least in certain measures, pretty much astray, right? When you have too many people, too many thinkers that are also kind of, all pursuing a certain path, pick Matt Walsh, right? For example, Matt Walsh, I appreciate him in everything he says, except foreign policy. In foreign policy, he's also basically equating, let's say, Zelensky to a leftistic whining regarding his country being, invaded and bombed and its people massacred as, the left saying that people will die because the right finally restricted abortion, right? Matt Walsh is, again, by his own admission, just talking about the cultural aspect of the story. Just hear what he says together with the other, with his team, when they make those reunions, etc., about international policy. Well, he's one of those guys who says, I just don't get the typical isolationist. I don't give a fuck about whatever happens in the world, even if this, in perspective, is destroying basically all the stability that I had managed previously to maintain. So something that should have been a pride of yours, and that is that just, well, I don't want to pay taxes, who the fuck cares, and, the world war disintegrates and I will have to cope with it much worse later. I don't give a shit. Well, that's the kind of thing, because admittedly, he doesn't know shit about international politics. If you listen to Jeremy Boring, Ben Shapiro, they have different ideas on other things, but as far as international politics is concerned, also they may make mistakes regarding the current situation and or owning positions that you don't want to hear or you want to hear, depending on which ones they are, whatever. But at least have a much more direct, crucial, awareness of the fact that there are certain specific interests to protect for collective benefit. That instead, another part of self-styling conservatism, which is actually alt-right, even if being corrected to say alt-right does not exist anymore. It actually exists, right? It was just a couple of years ago. People who believed in those neo-Nazi bullshit are still pretty much alive, and pretty much alive everywhere, and beyond much of this kind of concern, there is actual National Socialism. Because again, at the end of the day, not wanting a civilization to require you also to require in the first place an effort to be maintained is a form of socialism. It's another way of saying, you're saying, I don't want to pay taxes. First of all, is historically the best way, is to think that every single people that got conquered by somebody else later had said. But secondly, between not paying taxes and, asking for bread from a totalitarian state, there's no difference. Right, you are losing power as people, and that's the diametrically opposite direction from imperial, traditional, universal power. And that's frankly terrifying, right? And before someone says, but if are for empires, you are also for, I don't know, imperialism in general. I'm not for imperialism, right? I am for empires that work, because the only empires that work are the ones that are being worked by people, and that do not collapse because are completely incompetent and poor and underdeveloped, and fundamentally are standing just because they have nuclear weapons. That's a very important divide, right? So, and that's also your fault if they exist in the first place, and in the sense that if you're not an empire yourself, you can never counter them. And so disgregating yourself in the process, bailing out of any kind of cohesive effort, means that you are just too weak and too incapable, and therefore fundamentally an easy prey of anyone that wants to exploit you. And there is nothing to be proud of as a human being to be in such condition, right? And you will surely get what you deserve in the process if history is not clear enough, right? Imagine, in 1939, people said, "Oh my God, this terrible wars fought by the elite, and the poor people are paying, the common people are paying the price of that." Yeah, right. There were a lot of people in New York in 1940 that said, that were saying, "But Hitler is a good guy. Let's support him," right? It's normal also to live in a world where this happens. It's obvious that when this crisis erupted, we would have witnessed such kind of reactions. What I'm saying, though, is that this is being exploited on even individuals like children, say children in the sense of adolescents, or people that do not really are also remain children for their entire life, for that matter, from a mental point of view, that are essentially the product of this degenerative relaxation of moral values. That is to say, Generation Z, I'm sorry to spoiler your future, you're done for. You're going to be the slaves of the world. And the reason why you don't believe this is exactly why you are in the condition that you are. That is to say, it's always exclusively your own responsibility. Always. Which is also a point that is being denied, in fact, in this kind of broader alleged explanations of what's going on the world stage. Let's say, bailing out as sort of, I have nothing to do with that. I can avoid problems. No. If there is something that history teaches you continuously, from the Clausewitzian laws of reciprocity to basic international policy, is that if you give ground, somebody will seize it. And isolationism is one of the greatest hallmarks of cultural inferiority in the history of mankind. And as always, if there is so much isolationism nowadays in American conservatism, is of course because of the cultural inferiority of American conservatism, as much as that is perfectly paralleled by the cultural inferiority of American liberalism, that is equally degenerating towards a communistic direction, just as American conservatism is factually doing. Because always remember this, nationalism as socialism is just the first step towards communism. And nationalism and socialism are fundamentally the same thing. I mean, the concept is identical. It's always about you requiring a sort of standard right without having any duty in exchange, and rotting the whole thing towards the lack of any form of individual value whatsoever, right? And there is really not any other ways you can get around. Look at all the dictatorial, authoritarian regimes existing today, and see, even in the communist case, what they actually say about their nation, and you will have the answer there. Just as look at how socialistic all, in fact, nationalisms really were, and you will have your answer there. Unfortunately, there are also very specific causes to the American way to degeneration. We have the European way to degeneration, etc. The point is that there is a mechanistic, categoristic, positivistic delusion that you see even in how young Americans are habituated to debate things, right? In Europe, we are more ignorant, for example, about even political political labels in a broader theoretical sense. But at least we are closer. This is the other side of the story to the actual identification, correct identification in the political direction. In the US, you're much more communication focused. That's great. That helps, by the way. And I do think that what is going on today is also proof of American strength, right? Just as the US strength is out there in the world, and we are pretty glad about that. Just this thing, in the moment of crucial contrast between the two sides, from left and right, is showing some signs of collapse and of giving up to this kind of oblivion and this irrational, emotionalistic take and saying, here we have the Messiah that tells us, whatever it is, it's dogma, and we are completely dispensed from any form of personal responsibility. That guy said it, so I'm right. It doesn't work like that. I'm sorry for it. Right? It just speaks, again, of a deeply rooted cultural inferiority that unfortunately has been nesting and expanding dramatically. Also, in the United States, like also here in Europe, since the 1960s, the 60s, the 70s, and so on. And it was just part of a previous degeneration of the world, right, before. And I can make a video about that specifically, right? And this is not, this is a very serious thing, because talking to an American audience, I have at a point the duty as well to substantiate my historical view on it, and I promise I will make a video about that, hopefully at least. But it's always been my intention, and we'll get into that. In Europe, we still have other problems, and some are also even worse. So I'm not making it this abroad. But again, I'm not tender with anyone, and frankly, like in a broader kind of human exchange, I'm glad, of course, wherever you come from, etc. But the point of this channel is that wherever you come from doesn't have any meaning or any value until it's proven. And values are proven only in a positive way. If you don't prove them in a positive way, it means that there is no value, and that therefore it's useless wherever you come from. And this is a traditional principle. Right? If you're just attached to a piece of dirt, it means that you completely deny the meaning and the reason of the military religious principle at the root of the traditional empire. And that's a pretty serious thing. In any case, I will finally get to the interview. And again, I will be paraphrasing it, and so the video is there so you can easily notice if I say something wrong. It's a broader commentary that starts with this. Morgan's question to Peterson is Putin Hitler or Stalin? Something along this pattern. Peterson answers simply no. There is no evidence that Putin is like that at all. He explains fundamentally that Hitler and Stalin were very, very singular types, and that there is, of course, a bit of Hitler and Stalin in all of us. Now, this concept, the thing goes on. I will continue it, of course. To someone, here we're not debating. You see, this is the point of Peterson, that in many ways reflects I will not be an hypocrite in this, right? This is about everybody's. The decadence of our intellectualism, right? It's talking abstractions and or kind of diverting attention from a concept to another, right? Universal tradition was focused on reality. And the point that is made here is not whether Putin is Hitler or Stalin. That's indeed something pretty stupid to believe. But the point is not either to dismiss what kind of connection does exist in this sense between the two things, especially given that we're talking about Russia, and there is an enormous deal of legacy of Stalinism and Soviet ideology for anyone who, like me, for example, has been knowing hundreds of Russians. And if you actually know how they think, you will be pretty amazed, right? That's another thing that most Westerners do not really understand, because they don't know history, of course, they don't know culture, they don't know anything like any other person in the world. But in particular, when you talk to a Russian, that is still someone that you are, closer to than, say, suppose an Indian or a Chinese, you start realizing really what it means to be a Westerner in a universal sense, because it's like they don't have the palest idea of anything. They live in a completely alienated world where you truly understand the meaning of being deprived of culture, of course, morality and human dignity. These people can even be exposed to news, whatever, but they don't have the tools to understand them. They cognitively, intellectually, like they don't understand the difference between objective and subjective. This is a direct product of communism. I made an entire video about the Bolshevik ideology and how this reflected on the people. That's another myth, is that the Russians actually like Putin. They don't like Putin at all. The Russians are, by default, their entire national identity is founded exclusively on paranoia, lies no traceable form of any kind of education. And in this state of things that we will see also briefly later, they don't really understand what is going on. Right? In the West, we know every single damn thing that is happening on the ground, in every inch, everywhere. We have the direct sources, we can access them. We are just, whatever you think about the story, a wide range of complicated issues that also this kind of debates and views here really reveal in a broader sense. In that world, they don't have the palest idea of whatever the fuck is going on. Right? They even hear it, but they don't have, again, the cultural tools to understand it. And I'm very specific and absolute and concrete about this. I'm not really talking out of wishful thinking. I actually talk to Russians. Even still today, of course, I don't have any specific prejudice to Russian world. I mean, this extends by a certain degree also to the broader post-Soviet and post-socialist world. By various degree, you see that. This is the same, in a way, it was the same partly with the Ukrainians. I talked to them about what was going on before the war, and they were asking me still what, but I've been talking to Lithuanians, I mean, with Poles, the average person, right, surely even if I interview a French or a Spanish, it's not that they know, of course, but the Russian perspective is that dramatic, in the axis, is dramatically the most isolated, right, the one that uses denial as a constant, not problem solving, just putting the problem under the carpet and then going on with the increased burden that derives from that. That's why, Russians live 10 years less than us. That's why they don't have a first world standard education. That's why they are ruled, again, the way they are. If you don't know these things, in this video I will not discuss them, I will not convince you about them, but just be aware that the reason why most people in the West that are supporting Putin, whatever, do not believe this is that, of course, they are basically approximating that form of ignorance and cultural underdevelopment. They don't have any palest idea, not about Russian history, about Soviet history, whatever, or history in general. They're just brought to confer power to somebody else, in the vain hope that their individual inferiority will make them stay away from trouble. And instead, they are in the very eye of its storm, right? And you would argue they are also the most targeted by the economical situation. Yes, of course, but they don't understand any of the reason why of the economical situation. It's very easy to blame, the fact that the world is pretty messed up, right? It's just Walsh that says, after that shot on Zelensky and says, if you don't send us weapons, people die. Well, he literally said openly, well, people tend to die because, generally speaking, yes, they're mortal. Well, that's exactly, what you should answer to those who complain about, the fact that you're still dying slowly because, I don't know, your life is getting shittier because it costs more and you don't know. Well, you're going to die anyway. That's the kind of attitude you should address them like. And I would also like to remind these alleged Westerners that, of course, it's just a buffonade kind of title for these individuals that have nothing to do with the West and its founding values, is that even just their parents and grandparents were used to live with nothing of what they have, and they wouldn't even complain in front of such a thing. They went through world wars, greater, nuclear tent. They didn't understand much about the whole thing either, but they didn't have this attitude because from the past, some kind of moral backbone was still there, right, to withstand the normal harshness of the world, right? You gotten softened up, and where's your backbone? Where are your balls, right? This is the point of it all. Like, if you whine because of what is happening with gas and oil, and we'll get to the point where Peterson screws up, because he does in this interview, you cannot afford, in the face of your historical past, anything called like a cultural dignity, right? And you should be treated as such, right? And the reason, fortunately, because again, universal tradition is always right, is that you are paying for it, right? So you fully deserve what happens. It's not a weird elite. Even if, the elite sucked, right? It's still better than you. And that's the problem, right? You made the elite rule. I will repeat this to death. There is no establishment that rules without the decisive moral, not material, moral support of the people. If your morals are so high, where the fuck were you? Where, leftism was swarming and doing bullshit. The truth is that you were just the parallel of it, right? You are just mixed with it. It's your culture, after all. It's people that live next door to you. You cannot wash your hands, ideally, and pretending that it doesn't have to do with the problems of your own culture or lack thereof, right? So start being an actual man. And speaking on the grounds of that reality, in a context like this, okay, Peterson, whatever, that when people talk a lot, just by profession, like me as well, tend to have 3,000 things in their mind at a time, being pretty, running here and there. But here you are also on kind of you're habituated to that, and you should provide in front of a broader audience of something that about this specific topic should be kind of more concrete. You say that, okay, Putin is not Hitler and Stalin. I agree, because nobody's equal, right? That's the definition of it. Does this provide with any actual judgment, evaluation of or definition of who Putin is in this specific historical, political context, cultural context? Peterson doesn't give a fuck about that. He switches to there is a little bit of Hitler and Stalin within all of us, and Morgan, that is just okay. I will try not to be insultive here, but he says, "Oh wow, really? There is a bit of a Hitler and Stalin within all of us? Of course there is, right? What do you think? Because here the point of the liberal, you see here where the mental tumor that liberalism instills is the presumption that being an average person means to be a good person, right? You don't have to be a clinical psychologist to know that there is evil within you. You don't even have to be a Christian. You have to be just a human being to know that there is good and evil within you. And then, of course, there is a little of that dictatorial, totalitarian element in all of us, right? And Peterson, that again, I appreciate very much as a thinker in general, has made of power hierarchies and their dynamics his battle horse. So what kind of ignorant statement is there a Hitler and a Stalin within us? Naturally here Morgan is being friendly, that he is open to conservatism, and as I was saying before, if you've been a liberal your whole life and suddenly you change opinion about conservatism, well, maybe a positive thing in absolute terms, but in relative terms is, you're not going probably to be a very reliable person, because if you were sold to still not understand certain things, the question is, what has been your entire life about as an adult person? That's quite of a difficult thing. And Peterson goes on there with pretty sensible explanation, saying, of course, that's the same reason why, in fact, totalitarianism spread. Like, it's making the point I also always make about the fact that you cannot explain totalitarianism if you do not realize that we give that power. Say, here, it's more like an interior, again, psychologistic approach. Again, Peterson does this as a living in terms of clinical psychology. He obviously has mostly kind of an inner perspective on the issue, but I'm a military historian and I have a strictly political and broader, in fact, communitary perspective on the issue. And of course, the point there is not just what you do in terms of, you know, your own personal actions, but also what you bring to happen concretely, actively, just not by you know, incidentally lowering the guard, but by specifically wanting a political idea to rise to power, right? Which is exactly what, at the end of the day, happened in all of these cases. Like Hitler was democratically elected, democratically, maybe not in the sense that, you know, his means were so democratic, but in on the grounds of political institutions, he was voted by the Germans. That's how he rose to power. And the same thing can be said about any other, you know, dictators in a broader sense. And again, it's always what the people adapted to that made the difference. There are very, in fact, big divides, as I was saying before, between how different countries, different people actually make this. In fact, here the thing goes on, and Morgan makes the point that, you know, you can terrorize the people too in order to come to power, and this is what Putin does in a broader sense, given, you know, the overwhelming amount of repressions that we've been seeing, and that it was already there since from quite a while, in over decades. So it was not a secret for anyone, and of course Peterson at some point refers to the fact, oh yes, that Putin maybe is, yes, we have you know, there is I'm paraphrasing, a Russian leader way to, you know, say, to spread the terror, to being kind of a bit more similar, in fact, to Hitler and Stalin, right? And there is definitely a continuity there, but what I, generally speaking, don't appreciate about this turns of the events is that this interview, first of all, the question was referred to, like, you know, you should talk about who's Putin. Of course, you're asking to a clinical psychologist. This guy is not an expert about Putin. There are lots of people that, as you know, study the psychology of all the world leaders to kind of eventually sell their expertise to the world, because you want to know what's in the head of political leaders, whatever, etc. It's going on. Peterson doesn't have any particular competence in this regard, right? You know, he knows Russia by a certain degree, but throughout all his content, I've never seen, let's say, much of an actual, let's say, in fact, it's always a psychologistic approach. It's not a strictly political historical approach, right? It's what happens within their minds, but disconnected from an actual political or historical assessment of Russia, Russian history, Russian past, and whatever. And this is a very dangerous thing, because it speaks of that kind of abstraction and kind of, in fact, this scientific disconnection from reality that brings to the construction, literally, of castles in air. This is a bit like the difference between the interior lines of Jomini and von Clausewitz von Kriege, right? And it's a normal secularistic, modernistic, let's say, intellectual shipwreck that, again, is drifting ever more, and it's part of that broader degeneration of the world into which many academics are somewhat framed into. I must say about Peterson that he does display part of that impression, right? He does, as you know, his job as a conservative, but you can see, as for a scholar that made his, you know, his mostly his academic career in the 90s and etc. That was a bit the peak of that, let's say, not of the ideological fanatism of the left, but as you know, Peterson also comes from a socialist background in Canada, which is very meaningful. Like, it's plenty of let's say, far right, at least, they call it right, I call it alt-right, that is left to me, because again, there are leftistic base. It's like what you see really many circumstances, and that's not a positive indicator. There are ways and ways, naturally, to be a liberal, and you can, let's say, come to a more right-wing way of seeing things, even from a liberal perspective. But this is not what we're seeing here. Here we're seeing kind of a commixtion at the lower level. That is to say, the more you descend, the more you degrade, the more even something so simplistic like left and right that doesn't actually tell by how much your in fact mentality is elevated melts away, right? The idea of left and right is fundamentally by elevating the quality of your morality to see it as the clash between good and evil, right? And right, actually, the right should be the good in the harsh sense, in that sense of taking responsibility, the Uranian and Polanyian virile principle, and so on. Peterson, this is the point I would like to stress, that he should be able to see that, but he never ever talked about Indo-European mythology. He never ever ventured into some kind of strategic thinking strictly meant. I don't know if you have ever listened to a strategic analyst, independently from what they say or they don't say. They have a very specific way of addressing things. Nuclear weapons experts also, they reason very concretely in that kind of political and strategic field, of employment of such weapons. It's a completely different word that, again, from a clinical psychologist, is objectively difficult to have, right? It's normal. It derives from the degree of narrowing the narrowing perspective, ever narrowing perspective of hyper specialization in the academies, and that's what I see in Peterson as well, right? He could take this very far. He gets the point. It's as if he had gathered enough substance, but the form that is given to it is still not complete. And in the measure it's not complete, he's, however, giving way to this other more kind of destructive ideas. This is, again, an interview about who Putin is, and there is not a single assessment about that, if not, some kind of joke that Peterson makes by laughing, saying, he's a bit, perhaps, but more the Russian leader way of being this kind of more authoritarian ruler. And don't get me wrong, he makes it clear that Putin is a scumbag, right? Except, again, whoever has listened to Peterson, of those, echoing million views videos channels in the alt-right hub, are saying, oh, Peterson, you see, he drives away from this easy, childish World War II comparison because he understands actually Putin is a master strategist. The aforementioned Turley, whatever the fuck his name before, says exactly this thing. His entire video is designed on that. That's kind of a guy that makes videos with Putin heroically posing with the Russian flag behind it. It's the kind of, again, 1.5 million views, right? So that's why I was curious about this person's interview with Morgan, because I had any others. I normally don't even stop watching, especially Peterson's content from the channel he made, because they also make some mashups of all the things he says, like kind of collage videos that when you click on them, they always say, first of all, as a clickbait, listen to this before it's too late. Something that, by the way, Peterson doesn't say, but in injecting this kind of fear, this kind of paranoia, this kind of weakness, this kind of anti-traditional value attitude, to again fuel that kind of sense among the lesser. And if you actually listen to these videos, that they're kind of put together from different videos, and they don't talk about anything specifically, right? They're not themed really. They're just broader phrases where person fundamentally circles around, like in this case, without giving any specific definition. You would argue that, well, Schwerpunkt, we must see also things in perspective. So, yes, you must see things in perspective. You can circle around, but at one point you must have a definition. I'm a military historian in an academy that thinks that polymology is studying everything but combat. I study exclusively combat, and then I pass to, say, the cultural aspect of that battle in that chronicle without even knowing what, how a cavalry charge was actually led at the time, and that doesn't talk about tactics or anything. And I want to see in every single science not waste of time. I want to get straight to the freaking point in every damn thing, and that's why I butcher every single thing that I don't see done correctly, because the entirety of this whole thing is done not correctly, right? Peterson, for example, here passes, and I'm not, this is the point, I'm not against the concept he's expressing. I am against, in fact, the same context that he's expressing. He fundamentally says, of course, that the totalitarian kind of attitude replicates itself at every level of the power hierarchy in the community. That's perfectly true. That's also what the tradition is based on, except totalitarianism in that sense is not meant as the actual use of power, of course, but let's say an excess of power in a situation that will not cause, in fact, or an excess of any type, even the lack thereof, like also the lack of same power, and in this sense, it's the difference between the dictator and the sheep people, right? And this happens in every relationship between humans, right? And so that kind of thing in universal tradition should be balanced to make things work collectively well, right? That's why the Apollonian cannot exist without the Dionysian, because the Apollonian must rule over the Dionysian, but by elevating the Dionysian to the Apollonian system, right? And you do need both things. It's just like man and woman. It's the entire universal struggle and victory that is based on this principle, right? When you refuse to engage in anything, from direct political responsibility to answering to a specific question, it means that you're fundamentally unbalancing that system. You're not really doing your best. You're not pushing towards that top, from that gold standard that should be what makes the thing work. So in many ways, this thing is chit-chat, right? For example, he doesn't miss the opportunity here to say that, of course, and I fully agree, that the same, so-called civilized world is teaching people to lie about bullshit such as gender theory, critical race theory, and all these utter delusions that do not have any single scientific backing to any of it, right? This is not just an interpretation. This is the danger of the abstracted interpretations. It's not that we have discovered something new scientifically and we are fundamentally consolidating knowledge in that. We all know what we need to know. Just somebody decided that it's too, first of all, difficult to know things well, and that if you, express cheaper thinking that fundamentally just fuel that people's weakness, you can tyrannize them effectively. And this is what around that concept really only lays, right? Do not think that as a man and as a woman you have certain specific moral and scientific roles. Don't think that as there is any value in anything except race, right? Because that's too complex. It's too difficult, right? You should not care about making an effort in life. You should just be defined by essentially a single indicator that never changes. And all the rest of the world, it's too complicated to sort out, right? These are ideologies specifically designed for weak people, for diseased people, for people without education, for people without family upbringing, that do not have a compass, existentially speaking, right? And this is exactly why they're both by the left, but again, by the right as well, because racial suprematism is critical race theory. Again, I don't know if you noticed that, but it's exactly the same thing. You're not special because you're white. You're special because your ancestors that were white made a tremendous effort as massive human beings that you don't even resemble to. And for you to leave today with enormous power that you're not able to manage anymore. This is what it means. It means that you, right, if you were trying to make a compliment to your own race, you're just showing that you're declining. So you're, to your own same standards, you're insulting your own race according to that. Because where is your strength? Where is your culture? Where is your power if you're constantly whining about a bunch of, hysterical, narcissistic teenagers that say that you're a racist just because you're white, right? Are you really, that weak that you think that you're going to be brought under by that, and you cannot provide with an answer to that? You cannot silence that with reason, with human dignity, power, the power of your culture, the power of science, the power of morality, for you to turn into essentially the version of them, right? This is cultural inferiority, and you will never recover from that because you don't even know how to start with doing that. So Peterson is, again, trying to tell you the exact opposite, right? It's not flattering your own weakness. It's not telling you you should be good and brave because, look, I'm a guy who opposes himself to the left, so just because you're right, you're good. You haven't understood anything about Peterson. You make the same exact point that if you're not intelligent enough, you cannot understand this content, and you cannot turn that into any practical result, right? And we all fall short of expectations regarding this standards. So going on with the interview, there is a point about nuclear weapons, right? Will Putin use nuclear weapons? As you know, here we're mostly talking about the tactical ones that would, however, trigger a response from the West. And so here the whole thing is being discussed. Will it happen? Will they use it? Will they respond? So again, this is logic that if you have even studied the Cold War, you fundamentally know about, right? This is very different from the Cold War, right? In many ways, just like you cannot say that Putin is Stalin or Hitler, that you cannot take things also that easily, like saying, we've already seen this, nothing's going to happen, because this is new, right? But if you are acquainted with Cold War, let's say, in fact, politics and strategy, you're already used to the kind of references here that when we're talking about specific weapons with the specific doctrinal employment, the strategic situation, etc. All these things are, of course, different and must be studied thoroughly in detail, right? So this is reduced instead normally to, it's simple. And this, of course, depends dramatically on the political strategic circumstances. It's not just a doctrinal point, it's just a matter of decision, right? And by default, what will happen is not predictable, right? Now, Peterson, from now on, fundamentally starts describing the situation in ways that really highlight the level of lack of understanding, generalized lack of understanding about the situation, which is all essentially what the alt-right is waiting for saying, this is how Peterson also, he supports us, is one of ours, right? And then you shouldn't be surprised also that there is, for example, a hatred from a part of the liberal world, the one that still actually understands what is happening in the world, because yes, liberals can understand that as conservatives can, and again, they're a minority, just as they're from both sides, right? And the mass just instead sees the thing in extremely simplistic terms, and therefore is going to be excited by any kind of single statement that is just, listening what other people say and believing it blindly. Well, this is what in the aforementioned Turtles video really happened in the same identical way. So to the question, will Putin use tactical nuclear weapons in this specific case, Peterson says yes. Now, this is not contextualized, right? Here we're not talking about whether, you see, as a military historian, the judgment you must give here is always circumstantial. What does it mean, will Putin use tactical nuclear weapons. This is not a game where you have to answer yes or no. First of all, because nobody knows that, right? It can be more likely than not. It is more likely than not that he will use it. Given what, however? A circumstance, a situation, right? So here, what Peterson really seems to mean, in general, of course, is that he's aware that everything depends. You cannot predict the future, right? But what he's actually answering in this specific case to the question is, will he use it like yes or no? Because that's what he's really being asked. That's what people would like to know, because, again, people do not understand that everything is circumstantial and you have to specifically refer to what, right? Because there are not even just single, tactical nuclear weapons are a red line, allegedly, for a polity like the US, etc., and other Western nuclear powers to say, okay, up to now, to say, okay, if this will be used, we must intervene. Likely, and we'll talk about this also with again, it depends how, right? Because if tactical nuclear weapons are not magic tricks that wipe out armies just like that, right? The Ukrainian army will not be destroyed by a single tactical nuclear weapon, or Ukraine will not be forced to peace by a single tactical nuclear weapon. Some of these are also relatively ineffective to the operational theater that we're talking about, because really their power is limited, and it's not easy to wipe out specific units just like that. There are much more precise strategic goals that you must achieve with one of that. One could be not even striking the front lines, it could be striking a city, literally, killing lots of civilians, for example. But what are the consequences of that? In other words, which is, of course, not discussed here in any ways, the reason, first of all, is why wouldn't have Russia? Because this is the ultimate take that comes from this interview, is that in none of these positions it is explained what Russia's perspective on it is. All what is going on in the world revolves around the fact that still the two sides do not want to use such weapons. They do not want to escalate, because it's not their goal. First of all, of course, it's just a mean to an end. But as a mean to which end, and how do you see a positive end? And this doesn't even necessarily have to escalate in World War III. This has to, and the nuclear holocaust of the entire world, this has to be what are the political and military and social scenarios that you will trigger, for example, by using just one of, let's say, the least also powerful tactical nuclear weapons. This is a question that not even the Russians can explain, that nobody can answer. Nobody can answer to in this specific context. Because why? Because surprise, surprise, everything is a gamble, because everything is unpredictable. So again, even though there are some chances that this can happen or not happen, much of the deterrent effect that really these weapons are fundamentally used for, even though they can use, and they can be used, and if there wouldn't be anything strange in this broader situation, whether about Putin using that, this is what I'm saying. This video is not by saying, no, they will not do it. Much of that, though, is bluff, right? It is real bluff, right? Because if you have a specific goal and you want to attain it, and you know what you're doing, whatever, you don't go around even saying people, I'm not bluff, right? This is the entire point of the entire much of here we cannot descend even in properly the Russian political language, which was a very complicated thing because it's mostly designed for Russian people. So of course it's designed also at the same time in part for the West, and also winning over this kind of kind of alt-right and sometimes leftist, in fact, support that is gotten from the West towards Putin, and in this general situation and even beyond, because again, most of the consequences of such actions are really unpredictable, and nobody really has much of a great interest likely to do certain things if it's not at least sure that some others will follow, right? So maybe they will use it, maybe not. So asking the question, will he use it? And the question is, yes, he will use it, or he would use it, doesn't have any actual political or strategic meaning, right? Because it doesn't even start to evaluate the likelihood of such unemployment on a strategic level. Again, it may be even 99% or 1%, but you have to give me some goddamn evidence of what you're talking about. And if you're not a strategic analyst and you do not know how to talk about these things, it's very, imprudent, especially for a person who's so followed, like Peterson, to simply go out there on television and expressing such apodictic judgment and peremptory, maybe not attitude, because Peterson is a gentleman of some sort, but let's say still, oh yes, of course he will use it. How does this benefit politically or strategically, especially the side that you are supporting, right? If you don't even have, of course, an idea of what is your side that you're supporting in a broader sense, Peterson really has probably. He is surely pro-West, and he doesn't like Putin at all. But still, as I was saying before, in this broader confusion, in this broader lack of vision about what is the ultimate goal of this all, which is the base of any political and strategic analysis, you cannot really hope not to be misunderstood and to be manipulated to inflate, as everybody knows, dramatically the criticism towards the world situation from certain political groups rather than others, and we know perfectly what we're talking about. Of course, Peterson goes on, so there is some idea of goal that he thinks about, and I think that he's clamorously wrong, right? Again, because you can't. He's not a genius. He's just a very intelligent man, and he knows his work. He's competent. He has a clear idea of lots of things, but again, he's not really clear about setting, even just in an historical perspective, political strategic goals. This is not my judgment. He simply never did that. Like his figure, his character, his knowledge, his competence and expertise, the things he discussed, never, like this interview proves, never went like saying, okay, like in an active political sense, okay, we have to take this decision. Peterson is always very much an at the moment reflecting perspective individual. He's a very ethereal individual. He's a real intellectual in this sense. But in this sense, he doesn't take an open political side, even though he makes a lot of politics, right? And this is bad from a political point of view, because when you want to achieve a specific political or strategical role, you have to be, the best way to do it is to be very clear and very direct about what you want to get, right? You may hide it in a broader sense, but if you hide it to the same people that you're supposed to receive the support of, just like Putin is hiding the Russians, what is actually happening in Ukraine, because they just don't know it anyway, and he can play on that, you are going to be weaker. You're not going to pursue to obtain that result with the full force that you want. And this is also the reason why you eventually fail. So the interview goes on by saying, will the West respond to an attack? And Peterson, we're talking about, the employment of a tactical nuclear weapon. And Peterson says, what is it? No, because what isn't it for us? He answers. So he basically identifies the lack of a Western political and strategic interest in the defense of Ukraine. Like I would like to point this out. The entire, I'm not even descending in the question of the war per se. I'm just telling you what I see from popular culture, that the entire criticism revolving around the Western involvement in Ukraine is fundamentally based on the ultimate, even in this context, unspoken consequence, an unavoidable consequence, that Ukraine should be simply taken over by Russia. Right? I'm not even expressing a moral judgment of what this actually means. That, you understand, is pretty terrifying, because we have already seen what happens in the Russian occupied areas. The question, and at that point you would ask Peterson, that is a great critic of totalitarianism, like, what is actually that you want to obtain there, right? Answering what's in it for us in terms of responding to the use of nuclear weapons by Russia and Ukraine is a bit like saying, why should we, fight against the Nazis that are taking over Europe in World War II? Why shouldn't we give Hitler, the Sudeten after all? Because, we just don't want to pay taxes for a war, right? This is the kind of political weakness and disorientation that we're witnessing. Because I truly believe, and I really mean it, that if Ukraine had not been supported by the West, and let's say in the worst case scenarios it had been conquered by Russia, all the people that are complaining really about Western involvement in Ukraine right now would be blaming the West for not being involved there, right? It would be just, and that's why how vicious and narrow-minded and stupid the broader isolationistic culture is, because most of the people that do this do not really do it because they know what Russia is, or they know what Ukraine is, or even know what happens in Europe in general, or in the rest of the world. It's just because they hate Biden. Okay, Biden is a shitty president. There is no doubt about this. But in a broader sense, you are not going to win anything for yourself if you go as far as doing certain stupid things, like essentially self-sabotaging your own country in this specific case, because a Russian that self-sabotages his own country in this case is doing a very positive thing, because there are not two truths depending on two different peoples. That's bullshit. That's moral relativism. It's what leftists in the 70s thought when they were criticizing the West and saying that our culture was so advanced and the West was racist and bad. It's the same identical thing. The alt-right is pure leftism. You are going as far, just as Peterson here does, in saying, supporting Putin equates to go against critical race theory or the left. What the fuck does this have to do with it? I repeat it again. I've always been a right wing, and a very consistently right wing. I consider myself far right in the sense that far right, as again, in my opinion, is not really even right. I'm talking about the full-blooded right, ultra-conservative. And the obvious absolute value is that you stand for Western values in this situation. And if you're not able to distinguish what is happening, I'm not using this video to convince you otherwise, because that's the entire point of it all, after all. If you don't understand it, it takes years of studying to understand it. If you don't have that already infused, or it doesn't come from your parental background, if you haven't studied it, if you don't have the competence for it, if you're not an expert, if you're just an average moron, it's again up to you. You will pay for this, directly or indirectly. But the point here is that it has nothing to do. What you don't understand is that supporting critical race theory is supporting Putin, because you're incentivizing the standards of subculture in the world to the point of depleting people, again, of education, of years of life, of liberty, just like what the situation in Russia really is. You do not live in a dictatorship in the US. It doesn't, right? Saying things like, overjoyed because Peterson said that Putin is not a Hitler or a Stalin, but still thinking that Biden is one, I think is the measure of this, right? You don't have any standards. You're just like a floating banner without any kind of allegiance, any kind of value, any kind of standard. Nothing, right? This is, to me, the most serious thing. That here, somebody, more intelligent than the average, and believe me, nothing stratospheric, like Peterson, I remember once they were talking with Shapiro, and Shapiro said, if we are the best that conservatism can offer, I think we are in a pretty shitty place to leave. And they are aware of that. This is not criticism towards them. Generally, I told you, I'm sympathetic towards them, but they have been curbed also by this overwhelming push that has existed, again, from the alt-right towards themselves, that they somewhat capitalize upon. It's just like when the other day I criticized the fact that most people just come on Schwerpunkt for the migration era videos because they are obsessed with ethnic history, with Germanic history. They don't give a shit about any other history, including one of the same countries that they did a lot more later on. They don't give a shit about that. They don't study that. Nobody taught them in school. The parents never heard about that. They just want to hear about a race prevailing on another. That's the result, right, of it all. There is no other way. This is literally what is happening. It's evident from any single indicator. And this is the only fuel for totalitarianism that you really find. Right? Again, it's a common problem, both of the left and of the right. It's a qualitative problem. It's a vertical problem. And here, again, probably had something else to say, but here, what's in it for us? Right? And Morgan asks, well, so where is this gonna end? And Peterson says, well, we will see that. Right? So he even understands the fact that it can, let's say, he exactly in the way he doesn't exposes us too much regarding the, whatever he actually thinks about Putin or the situation. He doesn't expose himself, about how this will likely end, except that he's hiding something, right? That will come out in the end. We will see it now. And and Morgan asks, so what about the Ukrainians that tell us not to give the Russians any inch of land? And Peterson kind of skips this too by saying, well, I don't know, because I don't know what the preconditions for peace are. So, in other words, you're witnessing this conflict from years, right? You know what is happening macroscopically. If you still haven't understood what happens macroscopically, the question is, how don't you know what the preconditions for peace really are, right? What is that? I don't know. Like, what are you even talking about? What's your model? This is the entire criticism, in a sense, of this interview. Why don't you define? Why don't you come up with a value, with some kind of standard, with some kind of reference? This is just your opinion on the base of what? Exactly, right? And eventually, and this is where Peterson starts escalating in a direction that I personally don't like at all. He starts saying, that it's naive or something like that, which is another term that is used, in fact, by alt-righters to pretend that others are naive. Instead, they are not naive, of course, because they are very highly lectured, educated people with very high academic titles in respectable institutions that are not grotesquely, ideologically, corrupted, and that, of course, do not set any standard there, even to evaluate overall, and will blame, even, I repeat it to death, this too, a right-wing ultra-conservative right like me, and I presume a real one, to be a leftist or to be woke or whatever the fuck they say that again, this could be said to lots of people, but definitely not to me, as those people who follow me pretty much know, as to the level of brutality that I can reach, that is very much beyond the standards of alt-right, and that, except it's for a right reason. Well, the point here is that he says that we cannot pretend to think that Russia will lose. Now, this is here it is. Peterson, naive to think Russia will lose. On the base of what exactly? Here, there is a very powerful digression that I have make on the base of Clausewitzian theory. So, this war has showed pretty well the dramatically low quality of the Russian military under every single aspect. We have seen basically the highest military-ready force essentially being exhausted, irreplaceable on the short term, if not with cheap throwaway draftees that fundamentally do not have any motivation, even less than the one that we've seen so far among the Russian military. Every single political, strategic choice has been asinine. I've been studying military history for decades now, and I honestly cannot identify a more completely intentional, utter military incapacity in the annals of military history. Right, the entire decision since the beginning. This was allegedly, again, a country that should have been reunited because historically it never existed. It was just Russia masked with some other kind of thing. Of course, it's bullshit if you have read from my Ukrainian history playlist. Many ways, but not just that, right? So a country that you should have known. They should have been your home, your backyard at least. So you should deeply understand in everything. You screwed it up completely. War is a continuation of politics with other means, and so if the point you think that if the Russian military is screwed up in this sense is just, this is what mostly alt-righters, of course, do not have at large, like the overwhelming amount of people, any form of strategic education, think that this means just, okay, that you're politically right, but, militarily you can screw up in a different way. No, it's the same thing. All military disasters are exclusively, purely, and totally political disasters. This was a massive disaster, and it's not ended here, right? I followed in detail the entire military operations ever since the war even broke out. You can easily see from last year's videos that I was even predicting this, also because we knew that there was something going on. I also believed, frankly, that it would have been so stupid to do it all that it would have not been feasible, first of all, to take over the country in those conditions. And that's the only reason why I think they would have not done it, because otherwise I think the political moment was relatively propitious, but not with those forces, right? Whoever planned that operation is a complete imbecile who has never opened a military history book. If anything, for the numbers, you don't take over a country of several tens of millions of people of that size with a force that is fundamentally not even as much as the one of the local military. The only reason you may think this country could surrender is that you thought, again, that politically Ukrainians were from the Russian side. They would have simply rebelled and welcomed the Russians. This was the most complete misunderstanding, misassessment, lunacy, delusion that I've ever seen. By far, again, this was a complete and thorough disaster. The fact that Putin was planning this entire thing since 2014, that the entire economy was projected on this level, etc., as we'll see now, will come into question also in its effectiveness, but it doesn't mean anything in any form of political capacity or master strategy or whatever bullshit. Now, the alt-right is assuming that these people own, but do you actually know what it is, strategic culture? Have you ever studied the von Krieg? Have you ever reconstructed a campaign with the entirety of sources from historically scientific standards? Do you know how much it takes to become a military expert or of any sort? I don't think so. I truly don't think so. Quoting bullshit about Sun Tzu, etc., just proves the kind of, again, of cultural inferiority you were aborted from, and this is not really flattering characteristic of any kind. You're not an intelligent, masculine, or capable individual if you quote Sun Tzu, who even says that a general should never besiege cities, and that's exactly what the Russians did in a completely, insane strategic misassessment. How do you think you can even hold a country like that with those means, right? That you will have to resort to nuclear weapons at this point, and with which likelihood that the world will not retaliate and that you will be fundamentally causing up, unrest in your own country, just like, a mobilization of fundamentally a half of the forces that you have left, even, in theory, as the full Russian potential really can really demonstrates, right? You have been lying at every single step of the way. The Pentagon has given a perfect, accurate depiction of everything that was happening at every single step of the way. We are winning a war that is by far beyond the civilizational, cultural, and moral capacities of a country like Russia, that is just going to fundamentally collapse. Right? After this, however it ends, Russia is done for. Right? It's over. Right? This is not going to say structurally and historically recover. This thing can recover on the grounds of immediate economical, material issues, but it's never going to recover because it's never going to recover morally. Right? You can't calculate that on paper. That, say, just like the Western economy, the projections here, we will see also how Peterson is deluded about this. All the projections, yeah, you cannot predict at more than 4 months, right? In a way to actually invest in the markets, but like the long-term projections, of course, say that both the Western and the Russian economies will recover. The problem is what will have happened in the meanwhile. I remember there was a guy a couple of years ago when COVID broke out and said in one of my videos, this thing will change a lot, including it triggered the war, as a matter of fact, because it was this precisely exploited in that sense in what was happening financially after COVID, the disastrous policy of the American administration, all these things. But again, first of all, Russia hardly had any perspective of carrying out this successfully, but it even underperformed on the grounds that you could expect realistically. And this guy said 2 years ago, we are plenty of money in the sense that simply COVID will pass without any consequence. We're seeing the consequences politically, morally. We are in a war. This is a consequence of that. You have to learn that whatever your field of alleged expertise is, you are a completely worthless scholar if you do not understand that everything is intertwined, that talking economically, if you don't have an education in moral force, is completely useless. And that's the reason why, certain professions also are always dramatically on the edge of are statistically less economically successful, by the way, than one of others of allegedly, fucked up humanistic background. And this is exactly what we're seeing now. That people are saying, economical sanctions do not do anything on Russia. First of all, this is not true, really. But secondly, you completely misevaluate moral forces on a broader scale. This country never had a moral force. If they had a moral force, it would have already subdued Ukraine. They would have already used nukes, or they would have just had an army worth of this name. We all knew, also for whoever followed the news on the Russian military in the previous years, that it was a pretty shitty one, but we didn't even think. We were even given the benefit of the doubt of this being something more effective, also because nobody had ever seen the new Russian military doctrine in actual use. We have seen what this was, right? And it is actually ridiculous, right? The sheer incompetence of Russian political, military, and social culture altogether is astonishing. And there is a very specific reason, because you don't come out after 70 years of communism as a normal country. Can pass 30 years, 60 years. If that happened, you're fucked up for a good century at least, right? So do not hope that any of this has changed. Russia is not a paladin of European white tradition against the terrible globalist elites. Russia is anti-tradition. They don't know shit about religion. They don't know shit about culture. They don't make children anymore. They don't make children anymore in Russia, much worse than us. The macro-structural characteristic of post-socialist economies is that they're chronically short of labor force, because they didn't know the hell what it meant to live in a free economy. And of course they couldn't adapt because they were too morally weak, not materially weak. These people, what they do, they have to make massive cuts in pensions because they don't have, they will fall short of millions of labor force due to the dramatic aging population of the Russians. They don't have the pile of money on which the West sits, the pile of gold on which we sit, so that we can age but partly absorb this. That system, plus the war, more young men drafted, all these things will collapse even faster than it was already doing. You have no idea of the degree of decrepitness of Russia. It's an incredibly fragile and weak system. They don't have anything from their side, right? And listen now what Peterson says. First of all, there is this thing that he says, and this is the complete lack of political and strategic culture of this man that cannot make him afford to discuss things he doesn't know. First of all, he says, we shouldn't help Ukraine because there is nothing in it. Okay, so what's the alternative? Well, he doesn't really say that, because as I was saying before, he doesn't say that. That's the entire thing for which we are actually fighting the war, and we will say it eventually. Secondly, Morgan says, well, but, it would be a victory for us if the Russians retreated. He would be supposed, Peterson, at this point, to answer why it would be a victory, such as the fact that one of the major grain producers and suppliers of the world would still be within the orbit of the free world and not manipulated to increase pressure on Western economy, for not talking about all the energy that Russia would get there and all the bases that can reinforce in the Black Sea to intervene in the Near East, in Libya against Western strategic assets, and pressuring other countries, maybe invading Moldova, maybe invading the Caucasus, as well as that, starting to harass the Baltic countries, trying to shift the political balance, pressuring, threatening, all these kind of things, creating perpetual conditions of danger, with an increased power that at this point you have the chance of destroying, and that instead would create even more problems than it's creating now, and exclusively because it has nuclear weapons, by the way, because otherwise this is the goal that we're assuming. It's a political and moral one. If Russians understand finally what the hell is going on in the world, and which is very unlikely, and they will get fed up of this government. I'm not saying it's necessarily escaping the worst case scenarios, kind of. Maybe Russia will fragment into all little states that will start to fight against each other, etc., with nuclear weapons, and so on, which is still relatively unlikely for that matter, but in a way that would still be able to be managed by the West successfully, creating conditions of further stability, intervening in them, so getting the upper hand. Here we get just a nuclear threat. This is what they don't understand. What does that is the actual one, right? It's not a cultural power. It's not even in the economical sphere something that just switches off energy to the West, and so the West crumbles. This is absurd, right? First of all, it depends on a merely political and moral level. It doesn't happen on an economical level. We have gas and oil. It's not that we're going to be out of that. We're just going to pay it a shit ton before we find other suppliers, and we will start also reproducing enough stuff on our own. But in any case, Peterson says, what victory would it be? Would Ukraine in ruins? So this guy is literally saying in front of millions of people that the only advantage that we would have here is to leave a country in ruin. I mean, the entire political, strategic, or broader concern about the status of Ukraine in this sphere. I'm very cynical about this. I'm not even saying that here we are doing it for strictly humanitarian causes, which would be the entire point of it all, if anything, because if we value that also as a general Western in a Western traditional sense, we have more than a duty in helping these people. That whatever you think about Ukraine before the war, or if you misunderstand the entire thing, still believing the Russian propaganda that said that Ukrainians were carrying out genocide against the separatists were just, basically armed by Russians to break Ukrainian balls all the day long. Not saying that Ukraine is a model of virtue, but I'm not even saying that they were doing anything remotely comparable to what, first of all, Russia is habituated to do everywhere, and secondly, in that specific case, and not even by quantitative standards, I'm talking properly by actual political quality standards, right? What happened in Ukraine is pretty clear. And any misunderstanding in that sense is a form of undereducation. Why would be an alt-right or an educated person and a leftist not? Right? You're both a disgusting, ignorant scumbag. That's it, right? They're not really halfways. You do not spark for scientific or moral quality, right? This is told by the backgrounds from which you come from. It's easily empirically demonstrable. You don't make points, right? Peterson here is making a poem compared to the kind of videos like the ones I was quoting before that literally delirate, right? Mix Biden, transgenderism with that's the kind of mental disease that we have arrived to. It's just not using not just reason or evidence, but not using logic anymore. Because again, fuck logic, right? That's why you're leftists and alt-righters, because you're the same thing. And you love that. Or at least you hate yourself, you hate the culture that you're in theory trying to defend, whatever you think even culture is, if you have any. And that's your sport, venting your own cultural inferiority. That's it. And I stress this thing about cultural inferiority because I deeply believe in it. People today do not understand what culture is anymore. They think the culture is movies or songs. Here we are delirating in a broader sense. Empty materialistic relativistic indicators, empty abstract categories that just for existing are pretending to give quality to their content. That's the world we're witnessing. So what Peterson says here again, what victory would it be? Leaving Ukraine in ruin? The question is again, you said well before what the preconditions of peace are. I'll tell you what the preconditions of peace are. Put in the entire Ukraine, right? Or at least securing on the short term, because he screwed up badly some of the positions that he maintained. He would even settle for that, in theory. Except Ukrainians want to get back their land, right? And this is something also that the West should separately deal with, because what Ukrainians do is not necessarily what the West does, and the reason why we are there is because we have a common interest, as I explained, not because we need to die for every single corner of the world in this sense. There is a specific purpose why Ukraine is important. It's more important than Syria, it's more important than Libya, it's more important than other countries that also the Russians harassed, etc. Because there is a specific hardcore Western, concrete, pragmatic, material interest in that. And it's the interest that supports the broader struggle of a superior civilization against barbarism. That's why it's important, right? For those who say, I don't know, you don't care about economics. That's the utter bullshit that's spread among American pseudo-conservatism. The idea that everything, I don't want to pay taxes. I'll tell you again, all the time you study history and you meet communities say, I don't want to pay taxes, and they stopped paying taxes, they lost wars, and they were ruled by other people. That's called moral weakness. And in general, this is the problem, that this kind of materialism that has spread, it's a functionalism rather, it's the American way to broader degeneration in the history of mankind. Every place has their own. It's the idea that if something produces money at the moment, this is morally commendable. It is really not, right? It's an incredibly relativistic standard. But But this has infused, even worse than the materialistic standard, the switching of causes and consequences. You just praises the consequences, and you don't understand what are the causes that make it. It's just rolling the dice and pretending that reality doesn't provide you with a necessary responsibility for the outcome that you do. So, even according to this idea, why are, the moral people under in the social ladder? Nobody really understands, right? And in fact, from a traditional perspective, that's exactly where the moral inferior lays, and where, in fact, all totalitarian regimes rose to power through by eventually repressing even more dramatically than they were before. There is a reason why these things happen. Now, the alternative, not to leave Ukraine in ruin, according to Peterson, what really is? First of all, he said himself he doesn't know what preconditions of peace are. So why he's even discussing now that outcome, that peace? You don't know that, so you cannot factually define it. No, now leaving Ukraine Ukraine is not in ruins, in case you didn't notice, right? Of course, it's severely damaged, but it's not an entire country in ruin. And you know why? Because the Russians do not seek for that total destruction. The Russians want to use Ukraine. So of course there can be a retaliation eventually if they had to bail out of Ukraine in ways that you would not like to see. Russians are known also for, the strategy of escalating to de-escalating. So just imagine they drop some nuclear shot and they bail out. Well, yeah, they are so vicious and full of venom and poison to do such a thing against a country that in their mindset should be cancelled from the face of the earth ethnically, demographically, culturally, whatever, or at least, its remains being squeezed in a broader empire. That would not work because you cannot use profitably a country like that, and that's why Russia is a pretty lame power in the first place and cannot achieve that. And even if it was, do you think that leaving a country still inhabited by people, maybe even in a place in ruins, is better than those people being literally deported, like hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been, together with being tortured and massacred, and in the most horrifying ways, because just savages fundamentally do this, and that's what also speaks of their cultural inferiority. Great powers and civilizations and cultures and empires make wars and win without needing to do this because they can afford ruling over functional communities. Powers that are not even able to, they are clearly the second power in the world, are not even able to successfully engage. Now, I don't see even the idea of attacking the 22nd power, but generally speaking, to do anything right in this whole thing, and treating its own elements that in theory should be the part of this great culture as simple cannon fodder, starts literally mutilating. I will not descend into details, but this whole thing, what is happening there. Those are savages. Those are barbarians. Those are not better than the slave owners and cannibals, etc., that we shot down wherever we went in the world because they were just a bunch of I don't even want to qualify that because I could be banned from YouTube, but fundamentally this is what I mean, right? If you are paranoid about formalism, about things such as empires, because you cannot understand what it is right from wrong. Right, you can have a good empire and a bad empire, right? And there's always kind of a floating middle ground, but you cannot, as much as you cannot say that there are all equal people and that equality is bullshit, that there is no such thing like two things that are equal that are not comparable, right? And just like, before, Peterson doesn't actually qualify Putin in any way. One of the founding principles of Western identity is the ability of defining in a universal sense, in the in the, with some standards that would have to go towards the truth, to come closer to the truth, that also the pseudo conservatives today just fill their mouth with. I would never say this is the truth. I'd better say it's reality. So because nobody has the truth, so already the attitude of saying, I'm right because this is the truth. Who the fuck are you to have the truth, right? You have a pretty weird idea of what the truth is if you think you own that. So don't use adjectives like this is true or this is not true. Just be more proper, and people will respect you and will think that you're an actually intelligent person. Secondly, again, the entire value of that country, of its inhabitants, of their history, of their identity, would be simply wiped out. And again, I repeat it, if the West had not been involved in Ukraine, Ukraine had, in the worst hypothesis, been taken over, which hasn't, because it's Ukraine that is defeating Russia, it's not the West. Study von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz is very clear about that. No country can be supported, and no country will be supported by any ally if it cannot defend itself. Ukraine has been defeating Russia. This is not the West, right? It's what they tell Russians because they don't want to tell them that they suck as a country. And this is the same things that they told them in the Soviet Union. This is the same thing that they told them before. Always in the same way. So I don't understand really, or actually understand Peterson here. If he spoke, it would be more precise about what he really means. And there what says that the West is naive because it cannot think that Russia will lose. Well, the question is, Russia has already been losing, in case you didn't notice. Right? This is not, I don't know if you followed, again, the single military operation, what is going, the Russians have exhausted their military potential. That's why they resorted to mobilization, which is something that they wanted to keep completely remote from the Russian horizons before, because they knew, of course, that there is this tacit pact between the Russians and the regime. I give you power, but you don't screw up, don't make me go to war, because the Russians, in their identity and existential paranoia, are especially obsessed by this whole war mythology. Anything recurring war, they do not know absolutely what war means by any stretch of the imagination, not even when the Nazis were killing them in 20 millions. They were just used by sheer cannon fodder, and that was hardly a victory in the first place, but still better from annihilation, you would say. And that's also why the Nazis lost the war, and why actually a little comparison in terms of political goals and settlements, in terms of annihilating peoples between Putin's Russia and Nazi Germany, would have been very useful to explain what happened on the ground. And you're fighting against a country that in this sense is set against the threat of annihilation. So soldiers do not move on the battlefield because you give them a gun or you force them at bayonet point to do so. You can even do it, but you must motivate them. For now, Russians are kind of lamenting and somewhat obeying, but there is a nervousism there that is emerging. There is something about that tacit, implicit pact that is being broken now. And the entire situation definitely doesn't speak at all for a sound Russian situation. They don't. They're sending, by the way, all these draftees now in echelons, like the worst kind of strategy possible, because they will be defeated in detail. Right? You would need to have a major. This is a classical principle of war. You need mass in order to make breakthroughs. This thing is not going to happen. This thing is rushing to the last minute because literally Russians are running out of men to hold places in Ukraine. I mean, I'm not conferring to Ukraine any great military capacity. They've been terrific with what they had, but what they had limits them, of course. This mobilization to have been effective should have been at the latest started at the latest by March, because at that point they would have had replenishable troops enough for the offensive of July to continue and to hope to break the Ukrainian front in Donbass, where most of their forces are critically concentrated. And this came essentially 3 months later, and it will take a lot of time before it will bring any sensible result on the ground. And with they're rushing, they're throwing that, they're sending already some troops that they have been mobilized, are being sent straight to the front against any bullshit idea that the fact that it would have been retrained. Yes, some of them are reservists, but some of them are just sick people, that there is no standard, no criterion. They're basically depleting even their own recruitment personnel in order to send them to the front, so that the ones that will be recruited will be even worse in quality than the ones we have seen before. So then all this actually highlights the reason why Russia is desperate enough to use nuclear weapons. But again, in this situation of already, beginning of unrest, what kind of advantage would this bring? The U.S., the Pentagon, has been saying it in this day. We don't see anything that in these days should make us change our posture. I don't know, maybe when it's tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, they have to declare annexation. Maybe they will throw a tactical nuclear weapon or even a strategic one right away. It's possible. Nobody can tell you whether it's going to happen. It's just that in this situation, it would be a pretty, isolated thing. Like it could escalate quickly, but there are no reasons specifically, as after those declarations, that the Russian nuclear threat is in this very moment, I'm talking this very days, higher than at other points during the war, right? So it can happen. Absolutely, they can use it, and it's even likely they will use it. I'm not saying that it will not. This is very important to have a strategic intelligence, to realize that we have to go step by step, and that we can, yes, say whether things are more or less likely to happen, but in that sense, never been fully certain of that, because the world would be a very different place if we knew the future, right? Even on the short term. In any case, the point here that Peterson makes, and that really disappoints me totally, is that, and that explains that there is probably no connection between politics and the use of violence in his mind, in the actual realistic sense of the word, is that Putin cannot be defeated, he says, because he's a person to which the West cannot say no. And what's the reason? To make the long story short, because it starts also digressing on the thing of green economy and the fact that we've been dependent on Russia for gas and oil. All true. I'm not particularly in favor of green economy or anything. I think that we should, experiment technologically, but of course that more, the bases are others, right? And mostly nuclear energy, and also the old ones in other places, because there are other pools of oil and gas, and they may not be particularly convenient in certain situations. They will also exhaust themselves at some point. It's just that other countries have much more than ours, and we have also to think in the sense of adapting to whatever opportunity we can have, right? I'm not, again, a fan of green economy or whatever. I think it was a mistake. The greatest mistake was actually depending on Russia about oil and gas, and it's not an economical problem. Whoever distinguishes economy from politics and makes it just a material point because it's habituated to reason in terms of how, again, that it's matter that makes the thing, cannot understand strategic education, because that is solely founded on moral forces, right, that are much more easy to affect than the material ones, in a way, if you know how to play in them, and they're decisive altogether. What he says is that we cannot say no to Putin. Why? Because he has nuclear weapons, which would be the thing, but he cannot say no to us as well. So the thing is balanced, really, except the fact that we have a much better life quality than the Russians. So of course we have more to lose in that regard, but they don't want, where you're going to die like a rat you're not really caring perhaps too much what is the alternative, right? You should be able to self-sacrifice, and there are certain things for which it's worth to self-sacrifice, and you should prove there to have balls and not to, pretend that playing games like this is instead exemplificative of your quality to resist such a trial. He says that we cannot say no to Putin. Why? Because of oil and gas? Oh yes, sure. There will be revolutions in the streets here in Europe. I live in the heart of Europe, in a major Western European country, also one of the most affected by the current economical situation. What is happening? Are we burning cars all over the country? Is there a revolution? We're going to be destroyed? Nothing happens. People in the street do the same things they did before. They laugh, they do shit, they have to economize on some things, the ones that have less, but there is no near the tension that there is in Russia. And remember, they are the weaker ones, and we will find other energy. Yes, it will tough in winter, it's the first year, but we will adapt to that. It's normal. Again, all the projections, both for Russia and the West, is that we will recover. And not just because hopefully the war will end in a positive way, which is perhaps unlikely, but not because we cannot resist that there is. It's bullshit. We sit on a shitload of gold and much more. We have a huge demand power on the market. There are countries that have been rushing to give us oil and gas. And we have largely filled the stocks. We have other problems because, mostly industries are calling for, giving us gas now, right, rather than stocking it, right? So that's very important. And there are lots of issues in this, and they're mostly administrative, bureaucratic. There is the broader problem, of course. We have surely massive uncertainties about this winter as well. But altogether, no, there is not going to be a major disaster connected to the economical factor. The worst that can happen in absolute terms is that political balance will shift in anti-war direction. Even in this sense, no sign is being given. All countries are stable. The U.S. are massively invested in this. There is no way they're gonna unhinge. And even if you have whatever time that substitutes Biden, or at least has a significant impact on his policy, it's not going to be against Ukraine. The same goes for Europe, right? All the people barking that there is, oh my God, there are fascists now in Europe. You should study the history of European parties and European politics. This is valid for leftists and for alt-righters as well, but even for the common people that do not shit in the first place, and they're still part of the same, of course, group most of the times. We are all with NATO. We are all with the US. And the only thing that creates problems now is that Putin could escalate nuclearly. That's the only problem. So a person as intelligent as Peterson to say, we cannot say no to Putin, after we have already massively said no in the moment the war began, and we shut everything down, massive sanctions, whatever, is an unrealistic and frankly incompetent realization. It just does not exist in reality, right? We will suffer of this. This is true. There will be tensions. This is true, but it's not nearly as even the idea of giving up Ukraine on a conventional military base is off the table, right? We need Ukraine to be free. We would lose much more by losing it than by sanctioning Russia the way we are doing. And the only reason why there are people who think otherwise is that we have been spoiled. Again, think of how your grandparents lived under the bombs, as Ukrainians are, and show what Ukrainians are doing. And then tell them that, you're just a whiny weakly that has to pretend to be provided with, again, a cultural dignity without having even received an adequate parental background. This is the stupidity to which we have arrived. I mean, something so asinine by saying we cannot say no to someone in this specific case is nonsense. And the only thing that troubles us, again, is the risk of nuclear escalation. And in that, we are on equal grounds with Russia, because if we go at war with each other, we annihilate each other. Just think how stupid a people must be to be reassured by its leadership by saying we have missiles that hit, I don't know, 30 seconds faster than the other, whatever they tell them, as if, dying 2 or 3 minutes earlier, actually, would be anything to be happy of, because we would simply retaliate and strike back in the same way. Just think the utter moral, cultural, and personal misery in which these people live, and you fear to lose against them. So in this sense, I must say I've been thoroughly disappointed by what this kind of pseudo-conservative resurgence would be about. It's just actual weakness. It doesn't provide with any kind of evidence as lost criticism. If these are the most insightful, vocal, I'm sure Peterson may have addressed this in other videos much more thoroughly and intensely, and I still support him. For what he does in general. I'm not how do you say, cancel him at all. I just think he doesn't know what he's talking about, and it happens. It happens to everyone, except to those that at least know a bit more than the others on a certain specific issue, that it doesn't take much at all, and can say a bit things more in depth. So I mostly address, as always, younger people more, right? I'm not doing this because I'm afraid those others will take over. They will not take over, because we rule over a civilization that, when taking the reins of itself, it has to solve problems, has to be already beyond the level of the fourth estate. What I mean is that it should be provided by the mass of the people with more force. I'm making this not to say, oh my god, we're going to be eaten alive by somebody else. We're not, right? We are going to witness difficulties mostly related to nuclear threats. The others are all completely surpassable. We have the upper hand on it. It's absolutely not such a dramatic situation as you may think. Even in those cases when people really struggle, for example, to arrive at the end of the month, these are problems that will be addressed. We have the resources to address them. We're not without them. And who has more can make a sacrifice by themselves. Like, I'm going to consume less, for example, from my side. But what I think, in the same way, is that moral force counts. Really. Right? So this is surpassable. It's an easy crisis from an economical point of view, compared to lots of other stuff that the world has been through, also with consistent risk of other issues. Right? The political and military issue is a much more serious one. But as I was saying before, if they want to destroy the world, this is the point perhaps I didn't touch on this whole situation, is that in this interview, Putin is never addressed, really. Russian policy is never addressed, or at least, yes, he talks about what Putin could send Russians in the case of bailing out of Ukraine, which is also relatively unlikely in the way it's formulated, but it doesn't, again, talk about goals or why they would arrive to that situation, again, by a person that still admits that doesn't know what kind of the peace conditions would be. So why the hell is even talking about that? That's the incoherence and the logicity. He was not able to make a political strategic analysis outside of the realm of derailing on the psychologistic side of the story. That can be useful as much as you want. It is useful. Even this piece is useful here, but not in the way you think. And actually, that depends solely on how you want to interpret it. not on how this has been manipulated and distorted, unfortunately. And Peterson, by a degree, doesn't say it is his fault, but let's say somebody's acting also upon this. The same goes for Russia, right? It's not that somebody decided that this had to happen outside Russia, right? Even Ukraine was staying there, nothing was happening. Even the NATO joining talks were something else. There was this whole thing was planned, and it was, generally speaking, coming on the wave of the broader pandemic, economic consequences. It was all planned. I was saying that last year in October, November. This is the best way Russia can do something against Ukraine. And I thought of some broader harassment or pressure, whatever, as usual. We didn't think about this because, again, it was strategically illiterate, completely illiterate. And with all the consequences that you see, proving that it's a bankrupt country in any civilization, or under any civilizational standards, and they're really, self-destroying themselves, the more they insist like this. And it's them who do this, right? The entire alt-righter and leftistic, sometimes also, because leftists are against Ukraine in this sense as well, but some of them join, just they think the standard pack is supporting Ukraine without also knowing what the hell they're talking about, but at least they're useful, right? The problem here is that this whole situation has been caused by somebody else, right? We are indirectly responsible for it because we didn't prepare to the convenience, we didn't support Ukraine enough, we didn't convince Europeans enough that we had to get rid of Russian independence and all these things and developed a sounder, stronger European force. You can argue that the US also kind of niched in a way. So I'm not making any kind of, okay, there's just an absolute good side. There is not. Again, we are a bunch of degenerates as humans in the first place. So we are faulty, but still we are from the side that is doing more and better. And thus, we have a duty also in the wake of that, which we are losing in moral capacity gradually, but we are still better than anybody else around. Also, we are effectively being blackmailed by a weaker power. That the worst it can do to us is wiping us out by being wiped out itself. And they don't want it as much as we don't want it. Right, so Peterson, again, claiming we can't say no to this person, doesn't have an idea of what politics really works like, or how countries stand together, or fall apart for that matter, which is what eventually wars are really about. There's no such thing like absolute war, and so just from a Clausewitzian perspective, you know that if wars are fought, it's because the outcome has to be determined by fighting them, not by saying, oh, there is a magic power we can't say no to. For what reason exactly? Because you fear they will retaliate. And so with which consequences? For themselves as well. Let them do it. Let them destroy the world. Right? It will be their fault and our fault at the same time. And we will not be heroes if we let other people being wiped out in the same way and just continue to be blackmailed in the same identical way, because that's what will happen if the Russians win in Ukraine. It will never be over. And you still think that this is a pure, brave people that just is fighting against, the leftist insanity. They are the leftists. They are the cultural nothingness. And you are simply surrendering to it because you are part of it. And Peterson, by the way, concludes this all by doing what? By inspiring the West, by saying, we have to stand for principles, whatever. He starts rambling about the fact that this is allegedly caused by the fact that we have turned to green economy. Right? Even if this consisted in a truly significant part of the broader political and strategic entanglement that we're looking at, he quotes at some point something such as, why is this happening? This environmentalistic obsession is happening. Of course, for the same reason why there are leftists and alt-righters. And in fact, he says, why this happens is just in socialism. It's people that hate themselves and they hate the world, and there is nothing about that. Okay, nice digression, But then what? Don't you understand that the entire people that support exactly a loss in civilization are the ones that have these broader ideas towards war, and you're basically supporting them? This is what they don't see anymore, right? That's why I think that pseudo-conservatism at this point cannot be defined like that anymore, has completely derailed to insanity. This was supposed to be an interview about Putin's psychology, the war in Ukraine, so a military topic, one dedicated to a very specific person, and then a broader take maybe on this kind of Russian leverage capacity through gas and oil. There's not a single analysis of any of them. They're just peremptory, apodictical statements that do not enter even the single actual issues. And they're just, well, you don't know because we see things differently and we're just a bunch of debauched people. Yes, it is true, but the alternative to that, that's called civilization, right? So then what? Then what? It's simple as that. What are you doing? What are you actually accomplishing? What is your negotiational option? How do you think we could strike further internal Russian cohesion? How do you think the broader world can support? Hell, China told them to cut it off. China, right? And the reason is obvious. The Russians entered in a cul-de-sac. And yes, they are dangerous, but that's the reason why we should make them understand that there is a solution out of this, and that this unfortunately entails that they have to negotiate with us, because there is no way they're going to win, because what's the alternative? Destroying the world? That's not going to really happen. Or you may say, well, but Ukraine is not part of NATO, so if the US intervenes, whatever. Have you seen that happening? Like the same premises that you're using here is the ones that you can use conversely towards Russia. Why should Russia destroy the world? Why should the West destroy the world? Like, it's nobody's interest. And this hardly poses any truly existential threat to Russia, because the only existential threat to Russia, it's herself. And the only way to save herself is starting being a civilized country worth of this name, right? Not a second world cultural abortion with paranoid, schizophrenic, imperialistic incapacity, right? This is a huge issue, right? That they have and that nobody has ever resolved. As West, we could solve it in 1918 by backing the whites in the Civil War. In a way, we could have solved it in 1945 with 2 well-placed bombs in Moscow and St. Petersburg. We didn't want to do it, and that's where we are now, right? So if at the time we had been a bit more kind of thoughtful and people had not been weaker, we would have not needed even to destroy Russia, right, altogether. Things could have been done, right? So never underestimate, in this sense, again, your own personal responsibility in this all. And there is another passage that was interesting, in a sense, that I forgot here somewhere. Was an interesting one that he was talking about. Because Peterson digresses eventually on the fact that the whole problem why we are here now is because the West enhanced green economy. Again, I'm not a specific fan of green economy at all, but this is just, delusion, right? This is not really a broader. Peterson finally says, we I don't know, however, what happens. Oh yes, well, you just said that we have no option against Putin, but because of of gas, etc. But you don't really know what happens, right? If you have any political logic, you would say, that equates we should surrender basically entirely to Russia, altogether, everything. And how do you think countries are ruled again? How can expand their power in the first place? Well, that's through attitudes like that, by conferring them the power that they wouldn't have otherwise, right? And so this is a bit of a general paranoid, moralistic complaint as well. It's the idea that we sold our own soul for oil. Well, it doesn't seem so. Like, we thought that Russia would develop gradually, Putin would die at some point, there would be some kind of liberalization or whatever. It was a short-sighted political, short-sighted policy in general to depend on such a relatively unreliable partner. This is true, and it's especially Germany, frankly, that got itself into. But selling your own soul is just saying, well, okay, we're not doing anything about that. Of course, Germany didn't do much, right? France and Germany now have to provide tanks, other stuff, but they don't want to because they somewhat fear the repercussions. It could help escalating the situation, etc. But, there were sanctions, right? And it is true that we sold our soul, but by a certain degree. But when, massacres began in Ukraine, well, also those who had the more to lose from it sanctioned. And why? How do you think this also for the general paranoia against the terrible globalist elite, how do you think this would have been, according to a globalist elite, any kind of win or deliberate choice? Right, the incoherence and paranoia again of the fourth estate is terrifying. Another thing he says, and that I deem to be morally relativistic enough, is that think about the fact that now, I don't know, 350 million peoples will be in conditions of food insecurity, right? Jordan, isn't it a bit the same thing like with us buying gas from Russia? Like, why would 350 million people be in food insecurity if they weren't connected to the rest of the world, like in a free market we all do and we are all responsible for? Peterson uses specifically and openly, explicitly this thing by saying it's the West's fault, broadly speaking, because those people are starving to death. Well, no, it's fault of Russia that invaded Ukraine, a major grain supplier, preventing for months also in making, at least endangering the eventual delivery of supplies, and still creating dramatic problems for the agricultural production of Ukraine. That, by the way, my government made one of the greatest efforts, together with the others, to unlock this summer. So we unlocked that food for also those 350 million people that otherwise would reverse on the Mediterranean northern shores, had they to migrate because of other political upheavals there, and in, I don't know, whatever, especially in Central Africa, etc. And so I don't see how, this would be some kind of Western hypocrisy. Russia deliberately used the grain as a weapon to starve people that would hit the West with migration waves. What the fuck has the West to do with the fact that this country is dependent on Ukrainian grain and the broader global market, of which the West it's one of the greatest movers, together with China, etc. So I don't, and China doesn't want the situation at all, as you know, because they fear financial storms more than anything else, and they already said Russia to cut things short, and they didn't quite invest as much as the Russians hoped in them. The same India is actually pretty discontent. They decided initially for some reasons with some military purchase, but they realized that the US are anyhow their main suppliers. Pakistan has a huge deal deriving from food insecurity because it relies dramatically on Ukraine for food imports. So we're talking about all actors that also are the same. It's part of them. Broadly speaking, it's the same West, and it's everybody. It's also Russia's, interest, right? You can't blackmail the West for this political, regional target that you screwed up in accomplishing militarily, which was the only way you could. And now what? Right? Why should we? What's this rhetoric now that there is food insecurity? It has to do with the West and we and the green economy. What the fuck does that have to do with anything? I don't like. I presume to be a quite logical and rational person when I want to, and it seems to me that here there isn't any of that from Peterson's side, and it's just a contrarian, ambiguous, interpretable way of saying, you're a bunch of old idiots and there's no alternative, no, go fuck yourself. This is what he's saying is in this interview, and he doesn't even make a constructive point about it, right? Always, let's say, destroying as a without recomposing is not a civilizational goal, right? Only barbarians do that, and in history there have been hardly any until the 19th to the 20th century in the way we really could see enough. So again, for somebody that quotes Solzhenitsyn or whatever, and you still don't see what it means to be deported, to be wiped out, to see history books written with the most obscene distortions for new generations to be indoctrinated. I don't know why Peterson is taking this stand. Why doesn't he enter in the specifics of a broader, more unscientific approach to the world right now? And the reason, again, I presume, is because he doesn't study history. I don't say this, again, I don't study clinical psychology. He doesn't study history. And history is the only way, is the most favorable way, is the one that presents you with the actual real evidence, not of single psychopaths that need to go incur to you. This is studying what people actually did in history on a major political, military, and social scale. And this habituates you to a thinking that makes you see things much more clearly, and that doesn't make you lose in the details, but it pictures realities in a clear, compact way, so for which everything follows as a consequence. So I personally I have explanations that I gave here and there, even in this video, by about why this happens, right? And I fear that most of this problem is to be fought over in America, right? I speak of Peterson also as a Canadian, etc. I really mean it, because first of all, I know, as we know collectively now, that you, as my audience, come mostly from there, and you can see more directly what is going on, especially in the media. All right, I just was, impressed to see the degree of tolerance and our support in general towards such deviant ideas like the ones of Turley I was saying before, that completely also twisted this unhappy Peterson's take on the situation, I would say. And I realized, therefore, that numbers are big there, right? I don't watch leftistic liberal content at all. I'm not interested, and I already know what they're talking about, and I'm very dissatisfied about them as well. The main problem here, however, is that I can tell you that part of such attitude derives from not seeing what is really happening in Europe. I'm not talking about Ukraine only, but what is happening in countries like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, etc. These are very important countries in the world, and I've seen also from BBC, CNN, especially in the months after the Russian invasion, that the actual care that the audience, even the British one, actually has towards continental European affairs, and the potential that exists in our continental countries is completely neglected, right? We have been major players. We've been, of course, put in a situation of difficulty, and so we definitely depend also on US support, and we all are next to each other, faithfully and loyally, and this is our greatest pride. But at the same time, winning in Europe is more important, literally, under every point of view than you can imagine. It doesn't matter what those people in other continents really believe. When Peterson says those 350 million people that are struck by food insecurity, most of these 350 million people come from countries that are grotesquely racist, culturally miserable, corrupted, where they, they still burn people at stakes, or cut their genitals ritually. They're not really examples of civilization. So as far as that disgusting part of their culture is concerned, I frankly don't give a fuck about their food insecurity. Secondly, however, I believe that the broader Schwerpunkt does lay, of course, in Europe, and it does lay exactly in such support that we can give. I'm not saying that this thing will necessarily end well. I'm not saying that maybe the West will not back down, or maybe Russia will back down. That we cannot know, as we were saying before. But the only way to know is to be firm, is to make Russia understand that from this side there is nothing that we will give, and that therefore it's a useless fight, because they don't have, aside from threat from mutual annihilation, any other kind of advantage. And the first one is hardly one, of course. So it's literally simple as that. And if you start quarreling against each other because, say, Biden is a senile, whatever, and it has a government of disgusting, leftist, Marxist, even pro-terroristic individuals, etc., get rid of them, but don't even ever think for a moment that any of this is being created by some kind of stupid elite that, or genuine elite, because who the hell can ever do this in the first place, that is actually is the one that is cutting its own interests in this sense, in the wake of some sort of attempt of world domination from your side, because that can happen only if you give them power, and you have to be habituated to completely reverse the way you have been thinking, which is in fact an anti-traditional one. So there is enough good sense among Americans. You have a very strong sense of liberty in the truest sense, and you can start from there in ways that, if you really give a chance to, will amaze the world, and will always be remembered for the enormous contribution it will have given to humanity, and that will give you the imperium as well. So this issue here, it's just a 6 minutes interview. It's not really a matter of as you understand, personal opinion on the grounds like those propagandists really do, right? I am convinced that there must be a dialogue. I am convinced there must be a negotiation, but these work exclusively if you have a strong deterrent, right? I was watching in these days, just out of some free time, some documentaries about Thatcher and Reagan, and how people really even just were habituated to think and speak and see things at the time. And to think that only 40 years, not even, have passed from that broad moral temper, and to realize that we're essentially fighting against the same people that are in power, that were in the other bloc at the time, that we utterly despise, etc., makes me realize how much we need to understand history and not to give ground to complete hubris, Dionysian, Chthonic, Aphrodisian, Pythagorean, and Pelasgian subculture, because the collapse has been magnitude, and there is no other power rising as an alternative. There is just us disgregating. So it all depends on us, right? The rest is nothing to even be worth of any appreciation. And we have to make it very clear, right? So our behavior in the next months will be one of the single most important in history, and will have consequences, one way or another, that will never be forgotten. So you have the chance to make the difference, really. And as I was saying before, again, to conclude, from a European perspective, what I wanted to say is that our political situation is not as nearly as agitated and frenetic and hateful like the one that is flaring in America today. There are many reasons for this. We are different countries, different people. They also have so much in common, in fact, most in common. And we can really talk to one another in very familiar terms. Let's learn from one another. Let's learn your willingness to fight that has been always there for us, and let's understand also what it means to reason more critically and more thoroughly, and especially with evidence, with a moral and scientific base, and not with certain gurus that are supposed to comfort or discomfort your feelings depending on the situation. We do not have to depend on these people. Realize that even the top intellectual figures that you rely on very often are faulty, incompetent, and they are doing something that they perhaps don't even see themselves. In fact, it's always the same thing. It's always about not realizing the consequences until they're there, right? So sometimes, if you want to make a difference, you have to realize that this difference, especially the more important it is, comes at a very specific cost and sacrifice. This is what I remember now. I will conclude with this. Peterson said there is a situation where, say, you can get into, where's hell one way and hell the other way, and according to him, the West would be allegedly getting itself in one. It is to say, to get in a situation where there is no positive outcome. This is naturally a reference to the possibility of nuclear escalation. The way it really is, it's very different existentially, morally, mentally. There's never such a thing like hell from one way and hell from the other way, right? There is always heaven from one way and hell from the other. And the degree by which these things are, it's normally inverted from what we really think. Because there is always a way out. You can always back down. You can always surrender. Always. There's never a situation in which you will say, well, okay, now I will just, I never have any option. Just for the nuclear escalation, there is always a chance to back down. Always. Till the last second. So it's really inaccurate to pretend that you can enter a situation without escape. Because it just takes to surrender. Naturally paying the consequences of that. What is happening now is a fight, right? And in a fight, those who manage to win really obtain the whole thing at a cost, too, that has to be reasonable. But backing down is surely losing it all. So the only reason why we're calamited in this situation is an obvious one. The world is ruled by people who have very specific interests, and this derived from essentially their values, right? We are fighting for the right values, not for the wrong one. There is no ambiguity here. There is no flipping of the coin. There is not, it's the other way. If you're still in that point in your life, especially about this topic, it means that you don't know much in general, not just about this topic, but about lots of other things. And those, again, cannot be really fixed in a short time. So it's going to be a problem for you. I know it because I was there at some point in my life, and I fixed it. And it took a lot of work. And I fixed it because it worked, not because somebody told me. I'm not really the type of person that does what other people tell him to do. I do it by myself. So in this clash, we are fighting for a very specific reason that should be evident to anyone. It has to do with the word's liberty in the first place. That would be worth enough annihilation. Even if in the last moments of our lives we would damn ourselves for having gotten there. But it's never a non-coming back situation until that point. Right? You may not know where that comes, and that's part of the game. But you're also fighting against another human being. And human beings have that kind of moral swing that is easy to interfere with, right? And the hardest one to hit is of course the top, the one of self-destruction in the case of, not giving any chance. There is always another chance, right? And pretending that the other side has the strength to arrive to that point, or the desperation, it's the same thing at a point. It's unrealistic, right? Countries melt apart. Countries overthrow their leaders. Leaders also understand realities, and the Russians are squishy enough to tell their version of the story by pure fantasy at every time. So it's not easy to fool them either. In case of somebody wanted to bail out, this thing will not end well, but it's again being started by someone that we're simply resisting to, right? So we're not stepping into a situation where we have nothing to win, as Peterson says, at all. We have the stability of the world to win, and not given yet another Sudetenland to some. Even if you don't think legitimately that Putin is Hitler, but still this doesn't mean that liberty comes without a cost, or that you can, simply witness a genocide next door of people that were essentially fighting for you too. If anything, had they been fighting even just for Ukraine, because they chose a side, and that's what you don't see there. They chose a specific side. And therefore, this is way more important than it seems for us all to pretend that somebody is looming over us, right? Because I can assure you that from a Russian perspective, there is much more looming over than from a Western perspective. And this may be naturally a way, again, desperation, but it's something that they went willingly under. So not really because of any existential threat posed to Russia, that of course did not exist by any stretch of the imagination. Had even NATO, in the worst case scenario for them, arrived to their footsteps, right? It doesn't actually change anything about the self-determination of a country, nor about any intention to wipe you out, because Russia, doesn't matter, what kind of distance the nuclear, say NATO nuclear weapons has, it would be wiped out anyway, as much as Russia can wipe out anyway. So it's pure bullshit, designed for post-socialist, mentally damaged people. It's not for intelligent human beings. And if you are one, well, I suggest you to start acting to like one, right? So, and to prove it, because sometimes it's not really understood. And these are questions that I would like to ask Jordan Peterson himself, because given the responsibility he has in front of the world, given the echo of his words, that are very important in many ways, but in others, he knows they can't, because this is a deliberate choice. This is not a lapsus. This is a deliberate attitude, a posture that he's taking regarding to the matter, and it is wrong, right? And we must learn how to make the difference. And we don't have to wait for these people to magically appear in our YouTube video suggestions to pretend that, we can never be part of it. We all make the difference, right? All of us. So for today, I stop it here. I hope that these times are going to be really as good as possible for you. There is always a difference and can be made, and the only person who can make it is you. So let it happen, right? For the rest, as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.